Apologies, little technical last minute. The slides will be mostly complete. You'll miss all my fancy graphics, but I turned it on, yes. So yeah, really quick. Yep, there we go. So lots of stuff in the slides here. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but to help, you don't need to read all who I am in my bio, but the important bits I've underlined and highlighted in red or purple, we'll see along the way, so I can draw your attention to this. The important bit from this slide, I currently co-chair the global joint ISA 62443, ISA IEC, that's why it's joint, 62443 4-1 work group. So I co-chair that with a colleague of mine from elsewhere. Sorry, Mike Madoff. You know, Mikey works at Exeter, and we're driving 4.1. If you don't know 4.1, that's the SDL part of the 62443 standard. So the slides are going to look a little funny because all my graphics disappeared when they transferred from PowerPoint to iOS here. So apologies for that. But what we have right now is a bunch of people coming together now, starting to ask questions about secure by default. In the 62443 standard, we tried a few years ago to take on secure by default, and it was hard. It was hard because we were driving security towards the marketplace, and there was resistance. I don't need this right now, or it's too much work. So a 10-year-old try was pulled back a little bit, but now we have multiple drivers showing up. Probably the biggest one, again, underlined and highlighted here, is the European Cybersecurity Resilience Act. And in it, very specifically, they say OEMs shall ship products that are secure by default. Now, they haven't gone yet and defined what that means, but I'm working with them directly and taking our definition that I'm going to share with you here today to them. And so far, we seem to be reasonably in the same place. So we have all these drivers that are pushing us forward. I'm glad to see this graphic made it through. It's one of my favorites. I use it all the time. It's drivers of cybersecurity, because we typically think about cybersecurity, how do we drive it forward? And we want to say it's FUD, you know, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Sorry, I have to stay near the mic. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But the reality is that doesn't really work. What really works is, so this slide, this particular version of the slide is written from an OEM perspective. So it's competition. What are our competitors doing so that we can keep up and maintain parity when it comes to cybersecurity capability? But by far the strongest driver in this picture, it isn't the insurance industry saying you have to be at a certain cyber posture. It isn't threat intelligence awareness. Yes, we hear about the typhoons. Yes, we hear about all these different attack groups out there in the world. It's regulatory compliance. Back to CRA, it's regulatory compliance. And what we're working very hard on right now is making that 62443 standard that I talked about, the standard of conformance to CRA, to the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. And by doing that, we can drive this picture of, if you conform to the standard, you conform to the regulation. So what are the key concepts? Interesting. We only got 4, 5, 6, and 7 here. It's very funny that it only picked up half of them. But one of the clear points I was going to make in this is, well, so number one, which you can't see, is secure by default. And that's a bit of a duh. You know, if you have a cyber capability, turn it on. It feels like that's kind of the obvious statement here. And as you'll see as I go through this, it's not quite as easy as that. But what I will say is that the one that I have under number 5 there is probably the key. And that is because in using the SDL, that secure development lifecycle, that drives a set of behaviors by R&D organizations, by those OEMs that are creating these capabilities, they go through this process of identifying threats. They go through this process of setting, and I'll do the air finger quote thing, intended use. So the formal term is is risk context setting. You set the context for that product, and in doing that, you're setting, we intend on it being used in this particular industry in this particular way. Of course, the asset owner will use the products any which way they want. Of course, we know that. But at the OEM level, when those products are being created now, this is one of the key concepts to keep in mind. They're going to know about threats, and they're going to know how their product is intended on being used. So you put the two of those together, and you can derive a set of generalized risks out of that. That's an important concept to remember. One of the side effects that's underlined in red there is, key concept of secure by default, saying transparency and accountability. That seems rather obvious, but clear documentation on features and configurations. What we want is to be clear on, we have set this to a default state. And in so doing, see number 6 above it, reducing the burden. Now we're starting to drive towards that behavior that we all know, like from interaction with a bank. When you interact with your bank online, aside from your authentication layer that you go through, where you're giving your username and password, maybe another factor if you've enabled that, you don't know all the security that's behind those financial transactions going on. It's all taken care of for you. Yet in the industrial space, largely, we haven't reached that point. That the complexity level is still very high. And so in driving these things by default, we're going to be raising to the surface just how complex sometimes security is. And it's going to force the industry to take on this topic. So this, I think, is going to be a really important long-term benefit from this work. Okay, so we almost got some graphics here this time. It's a little bit missing. I'm going to go through 3 slides here, paying attention to time. 3 slides here that talk about how we balance risk and responsibility between 3 different groups. The product suppliers, that's where I come from, Schneider Electric, I'm an OEM. Service providers, these are the people that are doing system integration, that are maintaining these systems out in the field. And asset owners, people, I heard you say earlier, you're from a water resource authority somewhere. So great. So you're an asset owner. So from the product supplier standpoint, we use an SDL, okay? And as I said a moment ago, we have generalized awareness of the risks and how our product is going to be used out in the world. So we have generalized awareness of those risks. 62443 today directs the OEMs, 62443, the standard, like we heard Rick mention upstairs a few minutes ago, or he said his number 1 thing was standards. It directs us to put capabilities, security capabilities into our products. And every OEM that's conforming to the standard, all the major OEMs are conforming to this standard. We're all building capabilities as driven by 62443. But as you'll see in a moment, it doesn't necessarily always tell us, do we enable them or not? Do we just check the box and say, yes, we have a secure protocol in there? Box is checked. But then if nobody ever turns on that secure protocol, the security capability does nothing. So that was the second bullet. And then the last bullet, if we put the capabilities into the components, the last bullet says, oh yeah, and as an OEM, we're also building systems. And sometimes, and this is a little bit of a key concept here, sometimes those capabilities, like a secure protocol, require infrastructure to work. Secure infrastructure would require maybe a key infrastructure, a PKI. It's point to point. So you got to not only have a new device coming up with a secure protocol enabled, but it's talking to something, an engineering workstation, an HMI, a supervisory layer, a historian. It's talking to something, and it also has to support that same version of the protocol with the same infrastructure that's necessary. And so sometimes concepts are a little bit complex. And so third bullet, that's what happens. Here's another half slide. Fortunately, I'll say when I created the slides, I put words and I put pictures. So all the content mostly is there. We're not losing too much. So now we're talking about integrators, those people that are integrating the solutions and deploying them out in the field, because it's a supply chain. OEMs don't always sell directly to the end user. Often we're selling into a supply chain, and there are 2 or 3 steps before it actually ends up at the end user. So the integrators and maintainers of our systems out there, they have a responsibility to assess security performance needs. So in the field, they're looking for risks and they're assessing those needs, and they have a responsibility to deploy those fields, deploy those capabilities, in the field based on those risks that they've identified. And not surprising, the asset owners, slightly messed up here, but the asset owners have a similar set of responsibilities. The asset owners have to determine in their particular situation what risks are they facing, and they need to select the capabilities. This is the way the standard works today. They need to select the capabilities, make decisions about the target. That's that SLT acronym that you see there, the target of level of security capability you're looking for. And they need to deploy it. And if the circles were filled with words, it would imply that this is a continuous process, that being aware of risks at one point in time isn't enough. Risks are constantly evolving every single day.
It's like the blame circle. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. Your fault. It's your fault. Your fault.
Correct. Oh, wow. Okay. So the deficiency isn't this poor guy sitting in front of a computer screen. Maybe I'll open my laptop to make sure I can remind myself what these say. But I'll tell you. Yeah, but there's people online as well, and I want to make sure that they get the full benefits of everything. Just pardon me while I put in all my secret magic codes here. There's several layers of secret magic codes I have to go through. Deficiencies in process. So should you see this slide, one of the biggest deficiencies you're going to see is the way that this process works today is the onus is put on those integrators and asset owners to identify the risks that they face and make decisions about capabilities they need to turn on. So the OEMs, they merely have the responsibility to put the correct capabilities into the products. That's as far as it goes for the OEMs. Remembering my password. Going to my slides, which I do have open here. Okay, yeah, so I got two of them right. The last bullet that was on this slide that's written in invisible ink, it's highly secure, is the quick drive-by view of secure by default is that you simply, Andy, this is easy. Why are you making this so complex? Just turn on all your capabilities. Just turn them all on. But in doing so, there's no assessment of cost. There's no assessment of effectiveness of just turning on a capability. Sometimes you might make things far worse turning on a capability. You may make things more secure, but you're going to now compromise safety. You're going to compromise an operator's responsiveness. The whole concept of feasibility has to be factored into this discussion. And it fails to consider, as I pointed out, that there are system level security considerations, that you need to put that PKI in place. You need to have Active Directory with your roles defined, your user accounts defined, your password policies out there. So all of that needs to be in place as well. So it's not as trivial as doing that. Sorry, I got to change two slides now. The perfect storm. Okay, so 1 to 10 is missing here, but 1 to 10 talks about all the different places where please give me some secure by default is coming up. Some of them we all know and love, authors of papers here in this room that have written like secure by demand papers, a joint secure by demand accreditation program that's coming out of the OPC Foundation that you may or may not be aware of, guidelines from various government agencies around the world in Europe and Singapore and Australia. There's all sorts of sources of organizations raising their hands saying secure by default seems to be one of the best paths forward here. I even call out the MITRE ATT&CK for ICS because it's one of my favorites that also looks in this direction. So it's safe to say that back with those drivers I was talking about, we have some of that regulatory conformance starting to show up. Through the EU Cyber Resilience Act is probably the most prominent We have the Cyber Resilience Act is not in force right now. Won't go in force for right now. They're all trying to move forward in their products. And I dare say they all have something to do. I know here at Schneider, we have a lot to do. Sir, quick question? Okay, so the question for those of you online that might not have heard that is 62443, if you conform to 62443, can that be used to declare conformance to CRA? And the answer is not yet, but that's only because they're still working on it. They're still working on mapping the pieces of CRA to 62443 to ensure that there are no gaps. There will be gaps. There will be gaps. And then what will happen is that they will then answer with 62443 plus close the gaps, these gaps here, and they'll have their own local version of 62443 in Europe for a short amount of time, while those gaps are then pushed back into the standard. Anybody involved in standards development will understand that it does not move fast. It takes a very long time. It's 62443 is what's called a consensus-based standard, which means we have to generate a lot of consensus. There's a lot of voices that come in. In our own 4.1 group that I'm running, we have about 60 members. About 20 to 30 show up every Tuesday to meetings where we go through various parts of the conversation. We run a series of subcommittees off of that are 3, 4, 5 people that are all working on subtopics that then feed back in. It's a very complex process. So what I will say, and it's highlighted and underlined in my missing words here, is that the ISA IEC 62443 is now taken on the secure by default need. We've now taken that on. Actually, I have an error in my slides, so I'm glad it's not there. It says we've taken on secure by demand, which Matt's happy to see, but I meant to say secure by default. We've taken it on. Why? Because not only do we see all these drivers around the world, but even as we're working on other parts of the standard, we're saying, oh, man, we need a practice that tells us to pay attention to this and just to decide the default state of the security capabilities. So within 62443, we figured this out, the need for this at the same time. Paying attention to time, I got about 5 minutes. Okay, so we're missing a lot on this slide, but this says closing the loop. And it says regulation, awareness, conformance, standards. Those are all the things missing, and 62443 is taking this on. So what we're saying is this perfect storm of regulatory conformance is showing up. This storm, the fact that 62443 is followed by all the OEMs out there, it gives us that intersection point for everybody to get connected. So if we can push this through 62443, if we can bring secure by default into 62443, it will flow out to the OEMs. It will end up in all of these systems that we're creating, and it will end up in the marketplace. Now, this is strategic in nature. It's not going to happen fast. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy, but this is the path that we're on. So coming into the last couple of slides here with a couple more minutes. So how's it going to work? I've already mentioned that in the standard, we have threat modeling, we have security context setting, which gives us those generalized risks. The fact that we are aware of this allows us to determine the security capabilities that are necessary to answer those risks. And then the piece that we need to add to the standard is, okay, if you're aware of a risk, you need to address the risk in the product you're putting out the door by default. Not you have a capability and the asset owner is responsible for figuring out if they're exposed to the risk. Just enable that capability. But it's as you heard me mention, there's a couple of things that you have to pay attention to. So the first part of the standard, so it's 1, 2, 3 here. This is what will be in the standard, almost word for word. Each self-contained standalone security capability should be enabled to the appropriate level to address known threats and risks. Seems obvious. That's the drive-by view. That's the one that should be a fairly obvious get. The next two are a little more complex, which says, okay, but we recognize that some capabilities aren't self-contained, that they require infrastructure, that they're more at the system level. So as it's coming up on a component in the system, it should say, have you enabled my secure protocol yet? Keep using that example. And if you haven't, then what number 3 says is, if you haven't reached the default minimum state, that secure by default minimum state, then we should start giving you advice. Just like when you get in your car and you don't put your seatbelt on, you get all sorts of ding-dongs giving you advice to put that seatbelt on. So yeah, we're saying be freaking annoying and tell them you're exposed to risk right now. You're exposed to risk. Of course, we're going to give the asset owner the ability to say, I accept the risk. End of story. But we're going to be annoying, and what we need to do is provide clear advice on where to go next to get this resolved. I mentioned 62443. If you don't know the standard by heart, understand that it's a lot of moving parts. I would say 10 or 12, it's growing. I'm working on the 4.1 part, which is the SDL. You can see it highlighted and underlined there. We start by driving the basic set of requirements there that then propagate into the 4.2 and 3.3 parts, which is where components and systems are developed by OEMs. So secure by default will land in those parts as well. All the other parts, they have to align with what we're saying here. They will align. I've been vetting this across. Key takeaways, so we can wrap up with 1 minute and 20 to go. So what this will do is rebalance the responsibility for security and pull the OEM a little bit further into the conversation. This does mean OEMs will be putting fingers on keyboards and they will be getting things done. And this is the biggest impact. This is the biggest risk in driving this out the door. It should ease the burden if security capabilities are coming by default. It should ease the burden on asset owners and integrators to make the right decisions about how to secure the systems. It will enhance security preparedness because things will be more default, shift mindset from optional. I'll get to this when I get to it, to the system is pushing me in this direction. So it'll move it to more of an expected level of security. And it's going to promote consistency because everybody will be pushing security forward more and more. That's it. I'm all set. And I think I have about 20 seconds for questions or loud, raucous applause.